We have 3 continents in this session only. So please welcome Amanda Robinson, who comes from Aeroacoustics Engineering. Amanda will talk about innovative learning environments and how to evaluate them. And I'm looking very much forward to learning more about how to include several acoustic descriptors when we evaluate them. Amanda Robinson.
Thank you. I didn't come from Australia. I came from Canada this time. So I have moved countries. Still a long way away, but yeah. So thanks everyone for being here today. I'm going to be sharing with you some research work that was done pre-COVID. So in 2016, I was at Marshall Day Acoustics, and we were one of about 40 companies. Ecofon was another one, who got together to look at innovative learning environments and how teachers could best navigate them, and how we could improve them. And I feel very fortunate to have been involved in this project because it brought together architects, designers, acousticians, researchers. So it was a whole breadth of industry bodies coming together to have a look and do a really deep dive into innovative learning environments. So what is an innovative learning environment? What you see on the screen there is not an innovative learning environment. That is the way we used to teach, and that was when it was rote learning and repetitive copying, and that was born out of the industrial age where jobs were repetitive and we were, teaching the mechanics. But that is not what we are going to in the 21st century with 21st century learners. So this is an example of what was a templated design that was rolled out in Australia as part of the building education revolution. So when Julia Gillard came into power in the late 2000s, this was one of her mandates. And between 2009 and 2011, there was nearly 3,000 schools built, which were largely on this sort of template. It was, spaces that could be closed down, spaces that could be opened up. And because it was a templated approach, it was really important to get it right, because there were big implications about the rollout. The EIAS2023 project was really the aftermath of this, of having a look at how teachers could best navigate these spaces, and were they actually any good? So one of the first steps was identifying the space typologies. I'm sure you're all familiar with the traditional spaces with a central spine, classrooms on each side, going through to the completely open plan spaces with no partitions at all in the space. So this was done out of research from the University of Melbourne, where they looked to classify the spaces. And what we wanted to do as part of the study was to have a look at how the acoustics varied across these spaces and were there any correlations that could be made. And I like to think of it as the evolution of education through the ages, the kind of what it reminds me of. So you'll all be familiar with the basic acoustic metrics that we see, in most education spaces. There's the background noise level, reverberation time, sound insulation. Occasionally, we were starting to see the speech transmission index or speech intelligibility pulled in, as well as signal to noise ratio. What we wanted to get to was whether there were additional acoustic metrics that we should be considering in these innovative learning environments to help describe the spaces. And because we wanted to put a framework around the research piece, we looked to the parameters in ISO 3382 Part 3, which is for open plan office environments, because pre-COVID, that is where we were seeing our, education people going into those sorts of environments. I think post-COVID, all bets are off. The office environment is not what it used to be, but we're going to leave that aside for now. So we looked at strength, clarity, spatial decay rate, distraction distance, privacy distance, and the sound pressure level of speech at 4 metres, And that one for me was a key metric because that is where teachers tell us that they have issues in projecting, or they need to raise their vocal effort above that sort of distance. I don't know if you're familiar with EIAS, so we used the EIAS kit, which is something that Marshall Day had developed, to look at these parameters, and it gives a visual representation of how sound behaves in the space. So you can see on the plot, the red line is the direct sound, that is the stronger sound, as well as the reflected paths. So the line length represents the strength of the sound coming back, as well as the time period. Having a look at the different metrics that are used in the OECD countries, I did find out last night that South Africa follows a similar vein to Australia, so thank you for that. You can see that they're fairly consistent, although I will give a shout out to Denmark for being the only country that includes signal to noise ratio in innovative learning or open plan learning environments, and Sweden, which has the lowest background noise level in the space. For me, in Australia, when they pushed open plan learning to an upper level of 45 dBA, that's too high. To give you an example of the sort of spaces that we were dealing with, you can see on the left a very traditional space. They still exist, compared with a primary school in New Zealand, where the furniture is completely flexible and it is mostly open plan. I haven't got pictures of all of the spaces in the interest of time today. This is an example of another space that was done in Australia. This was a refurbished school, which is able to be divided into two separate areas, but again, very flexible in terms of the furniture. This was, I don't know whether you're familiar with the term breezeway. So it used to be an open sort of cavernous space, double height, where the wind would blow through and they would have their canteen there and it would blow everybody's sandwiches off the table. They decided to convert it into a single space and enclose it. And Newmarket Primary School, which was another primary school in New Zealand, where again, it's a flexible space. This one we had trouble defining into a category, so I think it fell into about 3 categories. So out of this, we pulled together all of the schools that we had, looked at the typology, and effectively separated them into traditional and non-traditional. Now I'm going to step through some of the measurement results, and this is based on the Australian guidelines. So EIAS2023 is one of the Australian standards that is used in both Australia and New Zealand. So that is represented by the red line, and for reverberation time, they pull volume into that. So that is why it differs from the AAAC, which is the Association of Australian Acoustic Consultants guidelines, which is a fixed 0.4 to 0.6 reverberation time. Out of this, the blue is the measured results. So out of this, you can see that a majority of the spaces, both traditional and non-traditional, were actually, hitting that guideline. A lot of the non-traditional spaces included a lot more acoustic treatment than traditional, and there were a few outliers in, particularly that the first classroom that you see, the Luther one, that was, a classroom with not a skerrick of acoustic treatment in there. So not surprising that it had a high reverberation time. The background noise level, again showing the guideline parameters. It was highest in a space which had a noisy air conditioner, but for the most part, a lot of the spaces were falling within the parameters. Then we moved on to speech intelligibility, and in this plot, the higher the value, the better. So it can be seen that in both some of the traditional and the non-traditional spaces, there were poor results, and that's largely due to the higher reverberation time in those rooms. There was a direct correlation there. I do want to call out the room on the end titled SMPS. That was a school that won a World Architecture Award. And at tender time, they cut the acoustic treatment from the space, which meant that, the school has ongoing problems in it. And for me, it was a real lesson in, having the acoustician follow through for the whole project. It's not enough just to put it on a paper and hope that it's going to work. Then we had a look at the spatial decay rate and the speech sound level at 4 metres. There's not a lot of guidance other than what is in the ISO standard around what numbers should be used for offices, where it's poor is below 5 for the spatial decay rate, and above 7 is considered good. You can see that none of the spaces actually hit that mark. For the speech sound level at 4 metres, you can see the classrooms with walls have a higher level of sound in the space. That's not surprising. So we're losing some of that energy in the open plan area. And that really comes back to the point, and this is shown with the distraction distance and the privacy distance as well, that what we were finding is that the schools wanted to have multiple groups in the same space with no segregation and run concurrent but differing lessons. That was never going to work. It's not a practical outcome to the spaces. And this is really reinforced with the distraction distance. So distraction distance is where your STI falls below 0.5. Your privacy distance is where it actually falls below 0.2. So the rooms with more absorption performed better. That's logical. But yeah, it was the sort of distances that we were talking about that you needed to separate for the spaces were such that you effectively needed a football field between them. So to expect 2 classes to run concurrently just wasn't a practical outcome. For this one, I will say we didn't correct for the background. So in these spaces, you would expect there to be a level of sort of background babble between the groups. We left it as the baseline background that we'd measured in the unoccupied space. So that might be a reason why these values are so high. Then we looked at the signal strength, and where there's lots of absorption, the signal strength isn't as strong, but that also means that it doesn't bleed as much into the adjacent area. So you can see that for some of the rooms where they're enclosed, the strength is high. That doesn't necessarily mean that the clarity of the sound in those spaces is good. So we were finding that, just because the strength was high doesn't mean that the quality of the sound in the space was necessarily, any better. So, again, reinforcing the importance of absorption in a space. So, in terms of the key takeaways, for me, I think it really reinforced that some of the metrics that we are applying to these spaces is still wholly relevant, especially reverberation time, because it is linked to so many of those other parameters. What I think we need to pay more attention on is where that absorption is placed. Teachers are very creative in these spaces. We found that they will, find a corner that will reinforce their sound. They will look to shield one another from different classes. But it's about getting the balance of that space right, and educating architects on, the importance of absorption in the space. And I think lastly, I really wanted the distraction distance and the privacy distance to be more meaningful. But what it showed was that the separation needed between the 2 areas would be ridiculously high. So that was not a metric that, we would look to include in the future. And that thus concludes my presentation. If there's no questions, and somebody wants to ask me a question about the image on the screen, then I'm happy to talk about that.